Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament. We make it to the book of Ezra today, and we'll get through the first couple of chapters in this. The first chapter is pretty brief, and it begins with the decree of Cyrus, the Persian king, and it is a fulfillment of prophecy, which we'll see here. Chapter 2 really kind of concerns itself pretty much primarily with those who came back at first with Zerubbabel. And I want to go through just kind of the basic outline of the book, if you will, when we start. But before we get there, to me, this is such an important part of the history of the children of Israel. And I want to make sure that we do take the time to really kind of go through that. And to me, in the last time that I went through the minor prophets, I wanted to make sure that we also taught the books of Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah, and those three books that are here, and in these next three books that are in the Old Testament. They really kind of work with what would be the minor and the major prophets, and as far as the timeline is concerned, and I'll get to that just here in a little bit. But them coming back to the land and the importance of them coming back into the land is among the handful of just super important things that took place from the beginning of the promise to Abraham, that not only would he have people that would come from his own family line, and there would be generations, and yet they would only be sojourners, both he and not only himself, Abraham, but then also Isaac, and then Jacob, who would ultimately see the end of his life in Egypt, though he was brought back to be buried in Israel, because it was the land of the promise. But for those first three, from Abraham on to his son and his grandson, these were people who lived kind of more as sojourners in the land that God had promised to them. And the idea that they would take the land completely was not going to happen initially. And we even get that from Genesis 15, where God tells him that there was going to be a captivity that would last for 400 plus years. And so he's told that at the beginning. And I'm sure it must have been kind of a confusing thing to him if all that was said to him is what we have record of there in Genesis. But it is still nonetheless an incredibly important thing, because God makes a promise to him that not only will there be a people that I will make a covenant with you and to your generations, but that covenant is also going to include a land, some actual territory that will be yours. And this is unique in all of human history. God has made one covenant with a specific people that are genetically tied to one another, because they're all descendants of Abraham. But it's also for a territory, and God even sets out what the borders are. That's also found in chapter 15 of Genesis, shortly after, when he tells them that his generations will be going into a captivity. So that is the first kind of monumental thing that takes place. So there is the promise that is made to Abraham that you'll have a son 25 years after the initial promise that he would have a son, and then on to the birth of his son Isaac, and then one of his sons, Jacob, ends up having the sons that we know as the tribes of Israel. And so that's, of course, incredibly significant. Their move to Egypt is significant, and it is prophetic based on that Genesis 15 passage that I had mentioned. They're there for those 400 plus years, and then they are brought out by the work that God does through Moses. But when we think about those books of the New Testament, the Old Testament, I'm sorry, that deal with that from Exodus, and then the books of the law, so from Exodus to Leviticus, and then Numbers and Deuteronomy, those four books really only encompass 40 years. So that was the time of them in the wilderness before they were brought into the land. So again, the promise made to Abraham is just a monumental thing. It's really the beginning of all of it. But it's such a significant thing when it comes to the nation of Israel. So them, for those, for the time that it took from the promise to Abraham until the time that they make their way to Egypt. Remember, Joseph was sold into slavery there, but had become prominent to the point where there was nobody that he answered to but Pharaoh alone. And then, when that Pharaoh dies, then there's that problem of the captivity that ultimately leads to a slavery, I should say. And then they're delivered through the life of Moses as God raises him up. Again, a very significant matter that God raises up Moses, one of their own. But then all of those things only last that 40 years from the time that they leave from Egypt until the time that they come into the promised land. I say only 40 years. It shouldn't have been that long at all. It should have been a matter of weeks, but we all know the story as to why it took so long. So, big deal, obviously. It's a very, very big deal that God takes them, breaks them from their bondage, and leads them into the promised land. Moses is on the scene, and then off the scene, Joshua, in another very, very significant matter, is the one who leads them out of, or into rather, the land. And he's one that the people can look to as they looked to Moses in very much that same kind of order. They come into the land, they establish themselves in the land as God had told them to, though not completely, not as they should have. We know really pretty much from everything that we've studied from the time that we were in the book of Joshua up until what we've just finished in II Chronicles, we can see that the problems that they had in the land was really very much because they never really fulfilled what God told them to do, and that was to drive all of the foreign nations out of their land and to have nothing with them, because no matter who they were, or even how small they may have been in their total number, they were going to be a corrupting influence on the nation. And that proved to be very, very obvious. We've studied it in these in the time that we've been going through this. Gosh, it's coming up on 2 years, I think, or a year and a half since we started that. But anyhow, with all of that said, the next of the major things, the life of Joshua comes and goes, and unlike what there was from Moses to Joshua, there is nobody from Joshua onward. And we know that the nation was kind of, if you will, somewhat adrift. God gives them judges and sends those people to them. There's varying degrees of their effectiveness, and yet God did some pretty amazing things during those times, a few hundred years. But again, that was a major transition, and it was an important part because of the transition that it was. It ultimately was a lot of failure in the people, but still, nonetheless, very significant that you went from a single leader of the nation, Moses to Joshua, to everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's where we hear that used a couple of times in the book of Judges. And it really is a great way of explaining what was that whole time of the Judges. From the time of the Judges, there was a lot of frustration in that. Finally, the people get to the point where they wanted a king. And so, again, milestone kind of an event. God allows them to have a king. And yet what God says about that is that, as he had basically had said to Samuel, this is ultimately a rejection of me, Samuel, and not of you. And so he allows them to have their king. So again, milestone, very, very important thing. They choose Saul. God allows them to have Saul, and God gives them Saul and warns them through Samuel that you're not going to like this guy. He's going to do all kinds of horrible things, like take your kids and take your taxes and just be a kind of a dictator. And he was a very unstable man, but he looked the part. So God ends up having his man as the second of the kings, a man named David, as we all know. And David was nothing like Saul in every conceivable way, from his stature and his physical appearance all the way to his heart towards the Lord, though he was not perfect. Solomon comes in, again, major situation that you're basically the king by whom all are measured, David. You're the son, and do quite well initially, until the problem is that he begins to have his heart turn from his many wives. We find that in 1 Kings chapter 11, and they turned his heart away from the Lord. That's what we hear about. And so 2 Kings, I'm sorry. So anyway, when you start to go through those things and those bits of their history, you see the importance of the kings, again, milestone things, because as soon as Solomon dies, then his son Rehoboam does some things that are so provocative to the nation that it splits in two. Again, a very significant era of their history. Now it is a divided kingdom. You have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, which we are studying about here because now they're coming back. And so the northern tribes, they were taken away captive to Assyria. The ones that were not taken away Many of them defected to the south and to be around Jerusalem, so they made their way to Judah, but then were able to go back into the land to the north, but it was without a king. It was under the stewardship, if you will, kind of as a satellite of the nation of Assyria. So what you have in the south, and again, that's during the time Isaiah is the prophet at the time. At the very beginning of Jeremiah, that's his time, and then he's into the southern kingdom of Judah, and then ultimately they are taken captive by the Babylonians, and there are all of the what we would call the pre-exilic prophets that are prophesying during that time leading up to the captivity. Most of the prophets are really focused on Judah, and so again, where we are in this time, it's at the end of the Kings. We studied it at the last chapter of Chronicles. They're told there, as through the ministry of Jeremiah, that they were going to be taken captive and that they were going to be in that captivity for 70 years. The 36th chapter of II Chronicles is the one that will tell us why there was 70 years. The reason for their captivity was because of their wickedness and all of what they had done. The length of their captivity was part of their unwillingness to do as God had said, and they wouldn't give the land the Sabbath rest, that seventh year of rest, and they did it for a cycle of 70 cycles. So God said, 1 year for every time that you ignored my cycle to give the land rest. So that was the years. That was the reason for those years. So during that time in the exile, you have the writings of Ezekiel and you have the writings of Daniel. And what we have here, as we look at these again, monumental things, the captivity and the conquering of Jerusalem at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. That is a very significant, of course, event, and they are taken away into that captivity. During that 70 years, though, there is a conquering of the Babylonians at the hands of the Persians, and where we look at here, he's also mentioned in the 36th chapter of II Chronicles. He's also mentioned here King Cyrus, a Persian king, and he's going to be the one that will send them back in the initial wave to rebuild the temple. So all of this was prophesied. We looked at it last week as well. It's found in the 28th verse of chapter 44 of Isaiah, and then it says again of Cyrus in chapter 45. But Cyrus is mentioned by name, and so that was during Isaiah's time. Now Isaiah's not in Babylon, and he's not in Persia. He's since died and gone to wait to be released from Abraham's bosom. But what we do expect, or what we kind of speculate, is that Daniel more than likely was the one who would have told Cyrus about the prophecy, and we'll kind of allude to that when we get into the first chapter. But again, these monumental things that happened through the history of Israel, the idea that the nation split and gave Judah, the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, to be a part of the southern kingdom, and then them going into their captivity. But now we're at the point where they're brought back from that captivity, and it will happen in these different waves for different reasons. The first one is under Zerubbabel. We always think the return to Judah, we always think Nehemiah, we think Ezra. We sometimes don't think about Zerubbabel, but it started with him, and Ezra and Nehemiah would be decades after the first wave that comes. So what Isaiah does is concerns himself ultimately with the first 6 chapters is looking at Zerubbabel and all of those who would come before him. Ezra is the author of this book. It's really not until the 7th chapter that Ezra picks up with what he did in the time that he was there. So what Ezra is doing is giving us the history of what happened with Zerubbabel decades before and up to his time is what you get in those first 6 chapters. So let's turn then to Ezra. We're going to be at chapter 1, and let's remember that during the exile, we have the prophets, again, I think I mentioned earlier, of Ezekiel and Daniel. Esther, the whole story of Esther happens during the captivity in the time when the Persians had taken over for the Babylonians. And then as you come back, when we start to look at Ezra and thinking about them coming back from their exile, again, one of those milestone things that happened. The book of Haggai, the book of Zechariah, and the book of Malachi. Those three books are written after they've returned to the land, starting at Zerubbabel, but it's post-exile is when those men are writing. So I'm going to put up now a series of pictures, and they're just JPEGs. So if you'd like, take a screenshot of these, and I'll put them up a little bit briefly. And what they mainly deal with is kind of a timeline of things. And there's an importance to these in the series of events. And some of these will show you who the prophets were at the time. It gives you a chronological timeline of the major events. And it was just something that I thought would be really important and probably good if you're able to take screenshots of these and to print them and keep them. If for some reason you're unable to do screenshotting and you don't have the software to do it, or if you don't know exactly how to do it and to save these images, you can contact me through the website, and I will be happy to send them to you in JPEG format. And you can get to me through the ministry website is at oldpaththeology.net. And I can just send them to you through email if that's what you would like. So these, again, they occupy their content with what happened during that timeline and some of the significant things that took place, and even some of the prophetic significance of the events. So there are several of them here that I've put up kind of in succession, and would be happy to send them to you if you're unable to, again, screenshot them. So Ezra chapter 1, let's turn there, and let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we come to your word. We pray, God, that you would give us understanding, and that you would help us in our knowledge of your word, and we would grow in making proper application to what we read and understanding the significance of it. We ask, Lord, that you would be glorified in this, and help us to see what these events, what they mean, and why would they be significant to us so long after. And may we really have a heart that is desiring to learn and to know. We give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right. So in this passage, the very first part of it, remember Cyrus is mentioned here, and the places where he is mentioned before, the last of the couple of verses 22 and 23 mention Cyrus in II Chronicles. We just finished this last week, so 36th chapter of II Chronicles, last couple of verses deals with Cyrus, and more importantly, the mention of Cyrus is almost 200 years before his birth, and it was written by the prophet Isaiah. Now, the idea that Cyrus would be so willing to do exactly as he does in the book of Ezra, again, remember, in the nation there in Persia, he would have known that basically what he has done is adopted the children of Israel as part of the captives that have been taken by the Babylonians. They've now been conquered by the Persians, and Cyrus is that king. So he really kind of adopted them as he would whatever else was taken from the Babylonians. They just come with the territory. So there's no reason for him to want to send them back of his own. So someone would have had to have shown him, the speculation is more than likely Daniel, because he would have come over. Daniel would have been there because of the Babylonians. And we want to remember that Daniel has a lot to say during the time of the Persian kings. It's primarily that, and so the idea that this could have been shown to him, the passages from Isaiah, again 44 verse 28 and in the beginning of chapter 45, it's a significant thing that he is mentioned by name a couple of hundred years before. So imagine being Cyrus, and Daniel is able to show this, or whoever it is that God uses, Daniel or whoever, and says, look at this, King Cyrus, you're mentioned by name from a couple of hundred years ago, and this is what you will do. So the idea that he knew what his role was in this, and the decree that he makes here, certainly shows that there's got to be some kind of significance, because Cyrus was not a person who would have been, from anything that we know, anything other than a Persian person, basically believing in whatever he did as a Persian. So the idea that he would recognize that the God of these people, the children of Israel, that one of their writers before they were ever taken captive mentions Cyrus by name, and that God that Isaiah is speaking on behalf of says, this is Cyrus, my servant. And it would sure give indication that Cyrus understood that because of the way that he addresses that. So we get that in the first verse. So chapter 1, verse 1, now in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom, and also he put it in writing and said, and it's the next two verses. But the prophecy by the mouth of Jeremiah, more than likely, probably the best example of that is found, and we looked at it last week, but let's turn there. It's found in Jeremiah 29, and we'll just kind of skip through the major part of it for sake of time. It's part of really a couple of chapters. Look at what we see at verse 10. In verse 10 of chapter 29, it says, "For thus says the Lord, after 70 years are completed at Babylon, I will visit you, and I will perform my good word toward you, and I will cause you to return to this place, for I know the thoughts that I think towards you, says the Lord, and they are thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." And that really should speak to the church, because this is clearly not something that's written to the church, though I see people like to quote verse 10 of Isaiah, or of Jeremiah 29. It's clearly intended for not just Israel, or not for Israel, it's intended for Judah. And it is very specifically about the promises that he has given to Judah in bringing them back from their captivity, of a future and of a hope. And it's spoken very, very specifically to the captives of Judah. Does that mean that God doesn't have plans and thoughts towards us in the church? Sure. And we can look at plenty of passages in the New Testament that say exactly that, without having to take something out of context from the Old Testament and try to apply it to the church. So, anyhow, he ends up saying in verse 17, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, I will send on them the sword of famine and of pestilence, and I will make them like rotting figs that cannot be eaten. And they are so bad, and I will pursue them with the sword, with famine, and with pestilence, and I will deliver them to trouble among the kingdoms of the earth, to be a curse and an astonishment and a hissing and a reproach among all the nations where I have driven them, because they did not heed my words." So this is, again, what God had said as far as the nation was concerned. There was a cause for their captivity, but God had said, though I had driven them out, the promise is that I'm going to bring them back at the end of that 70 years. But it wasn't just some arbitrary thing. God didn't just have a problem with something without telling them. He warned them in advance and explained the reasons why for their captivity, and yet, because of promises that he had made, he was not going to let them be gone forever. He judged them, but that judgment had a length of time attached to it. Doesn't mean that they're out of the woods. We're going to see what happens even after they come back and really establish everything as it should be during Ezra and Nehemiah. By the end of what we read with Malachi, it becomes a disaster under Malachi's time. And really the priesthood becomes so corrupt during Malachi's time that there really isn't much in the way of a priesthood that's operating as God would want them to, and they're pretty much adrift. Even into the time of when Jesus was there, we can see how absolutely devoid of righteous leadership that there was in the nation during Jesus' time. So with all of that said, let's get back to Ezra, and we'll take a look at the things said of Cyrus. So, I'm sorry, it's 3 verses in his proclamation. So here's what he writes. "Thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God has given to me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. That's very specific. So again, God's not speaking to Persian kings unless he has a purpose for doing so, and he's going to have to use somebody to be able to show him what is in the writings that don't really belong to him. These would be the writings of Isaiah that really spell it out by name, and that it is he, Cyrus. So that's why it seems pretty. I don't know how else we could account for that he would know that God has called on him to do this, and so it would be a very compelling thing if you could show that he was prophesied about. So that would be, again, speculation. Could God have shown him all of this? Sure, he could have, but the idea that he had written it out in advance probably gives indication, and it would be a very good reason why he would see that it would need to be the fulfillment of sending a number of people back, the volunteers that would go. So he goes on, it says, now who is among you of all his people? May his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and to build the house of the Lord God of Israel, which is in Jerusalem. And whoever is left in any place where he dwells, let the men of his place help him with silver and gold, with goods and with livestock, besides the freewill offering for the house of God which is in Jerusalem. This is, again, one of those times when you find that God had mentioned, again, I keep alluding back to it in chapter 15 of Genesis, where God says that they're going to go away into a captivity. And it's not that he looks at Egypt in that case as being a righteous people. In fact, he says when they leave, they're going to plunder Egypt. He doesn't mention Egypt by name, but we know by putting the pieces together, because that was the first time that they would ever have to go into a captivity and an enslavement. But God says when they come out, they're going to come out with all kinds of plunder, which is exactly what took place. And so some people would look at that and say it's kind of back wages for all of their time of slavery. So they were able to get that. Is this another similar kind of a thing where they had gone and they were taken away for their own reasons, but God is going to also have to deal with those nations, that how they dealt with Israel was going to be something that they would have to answer for. We know that happened with Babylon, and here in this case, Cyrus recognizes who he is historically and what God wants to do. So really significant that he does this, to the point where he's even saying, those of you who have them among you and work among you, or if there are people who serve you or whatever else, you're going to take anybody who wants to go, and you're going to let them go, and you're going to give them of the wealth and whatnot that is due, and you're going to send them out with what they need resource-wise for this work. So what an amazing thing that this king sees this as he's the person that God has raised up to do this thing. So it says in verse 5, so the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and of Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all those whose spirits God had moved, arose to go up and to build the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem. So as he's doing this work with Cyrus, and however he's getting his information, God is preparing the pagan nation to do what he does. At the same time, he's moving on the hearts of the people who would go back there, not only to do the building of the temple again, but also the people who would have to be serving in it. And so, as we saw with Josiah, there would have to be something that would be in print that they would be able to look to and know exactly what was required of them and how they were to do proper worship and to do the proper things as far as the temple is concerned. So we're going to find that once they get there, there's going to be a lot of resistance that they're going to get that'll go all the way through Nehemiah's time. And so just going back and starting the temple and rebuilding the temple, there's so much more that will need to be done, and it will be done in waves. So God begins to move in a couple of different ways. He moves, first of all, on the secular, the foreign leadership, or the foreign sovereigns, that his people are going to be sent back, and they are going to help to bankroll the whole thing. But at the same time, they're not being forced to go. God moves on the people that he wants to go at that time. So we see in verse 6, and all those who were around them encouraged them with articles of silver and of gold, of goods and livestock, and with precious things, besides all that was willingly offered. So King Cyrus also does what he does, but notice that there is the material things that they're going to need. But remember, in order to do the service around the temple, it was going to be necessary for them to have the implements to do what would be the correct corporate worship, and all of that stuff needed to meet some specific guidelines of what it was and how they were supposed to be used. So all the implements for the sacrifices and all the rest, that stuff is still lying around. Look at what verse 7 says. So Cyrus then also brought the articles from the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem and put in the temple of his gods. Cyrus, the king of Persia, brought them out by the hand of Misredath, the treasurer, and he counted them out to Shashbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this is the number of them. It is 30 gold platters, 1,000 silver platters, 29 knives, 30 gold basins, 410 silver basins of similar kind, and 1,000 other articles. All the articles of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these Shashbazzar took with the captives that were brought back from Babylon to Jerusalem. So they have the material goods, the material wealth of things. They have livestock. They have the things that will help to sustain them. But if they're going to also do this reparative work on the temple, then they're going to need to get back to the kind of corporate worship that's necessary. It's not going to really be as it should until Ezra shows up, but this will start the process. And so just remember that this kind of happens in an incremental way, and it happens again in 3 major waves of them getting it back to the way that it's supposed to be. It will go from the temple being built with Zerubbabel to the correct type of worship and the kind of corporate way of things to be under Ezra. And then there is the way of safeguarding the city once again through the time of Nehemiah. So with all of that said, it tells us in verse 2, these are the people of the province who came back from the captivity of those who had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away to Babylon, and who returned to Jerusalem and to Judah, everyone to his own city. So here's an important thing, and we're going to see a little bit later on in the chapter. You've heard me mention before, the reason for their genealogies, they recognized the importance of genealogies because it wasn't going to be something that was just kind of left to chance. There had to be in their own hearts and minds written records. We saw a very important one of those things, that the idea of written records and what family you belong to and all the rest of that was very significant, because we see that God had said, I'm cutting off the line really back to Solomon because of the wickedness of Jehoiachin. And so God says, I see him as childless, though he had sons and daughters. But it was God's way of saying, because of his wickedness, and really the people who before him, that whole line coming from Solomon is one that's going to be cut off. Like there's not going to be an heir that God would recognize from them. But the importance of that and the significance of that is that there was a promise made to David that from his line would come the one that would be an everlasting king and an everlasting kingdom. But if it doesn't come through Solomon, then that's a major obstacle, or at least it would be as we would see it. But we know that through the genealogies that we studied before last week, actually, we know that there's a clean bloodline that comes through Mary's line, and it comes down through David's son Nathan and not through Solomon. So if it wasn't for their meticulous care with genealogies, we really wouldn't be able to nail all of that stuff down. And we know that God cut off the line of Solomon. So what's to be done? Well, if not for their care and concern for genealogies and family things, this would be a significant obstacle. Well, what we have really for most of this chapter is kind of dealing with the people who came back with Zerubbabel. We get that in verse 2. Those who came back with Zerubbabel were Jeshua and Nehemiah, and it's not the same Nehemiah, because that Nehemiah that has the book that's written of him and by him really deals with a time in their history way down the line. And so that Nehemiah that we know from the book of Nehemiah that we'll be studying here shortly is somebody who's decades down the road of coming back. He was not there originally. It's a different one. So you'll notice the names of all of these people, and it will say the different places where they came from. Now, this says where they went back to, which means that even during these 70 years, it was maintained where, even in their captivity, where they were from, what their rights were. And as these names are written down here, this is an official record to say this is where they were before, and when they go back, this is where they will go back to. So all of this information was preserved in these 70 years. Now they're able to go back. And we're going to see that that isn't just something that somebody could vouch for and say, well, this is where I came from, this is my house, this is my land, this is where I was from. There's got to be a written record of it, and without that written record, you'll see what ends up happening when it comes to that. Mentioned that the people that verse 21 mentions the people of Bethlehem. Many of these different towns that we see are ones that are not even known to us, but they would be in the territory of either Benjamin or of Judah. But Bethlehem is definitely one of those that are very, very obvious. It says 123. Imagine that. The people going back to a whole town of Bethlehem is only 123 are going back to there. Now, we know that there are some people already living in the land. We'll get into that as we go through this book. But the idea that the original inhabitants, the people that were of the promise, and the people who are entitled to the land, such a small number in that one city, that one town of 123. So you can go through those. In verse 36, you have the priests that are mentioned here. So remember what is really included in this. It's the people by the city and by the number. So it's the people who will be involved in making sure that everything that's necessary to help with the building, but all of the support that goes along with it. So there will be all of the industry or whatever you want to call it. It's not everybody's going to be building the buildings, but people will need to be craftsmen. People will need to be taking care of the other needs. There's got to be food. There's got to be shelter. There's got to be all these things. So everybody's going to go back and have a hand in this. But the main objective is the temple, and yet we all realize that there is logistically a lot of other things that need to take place. So we're also hearing at verse 36, the priests, the son of Jediah, the house of Jeshua, they had 973. So these were the priests. And then of the different households of priests, this is how many that there were. It says in verse 40, of course, the sons of, or the Levites. So you have the priests and you have the Levites. So the Levites would be the ones who would be assisting the priests in the work of the temple. They're going back. There's going to be a lot of preparation, obviously, that needs to take place. They're going to have to kind of pick up with all of the destruction that happened at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar and whatever else has happened in those 70 years to break it down. So once the priests are able to start offering the offerings, there are the Levites who have to do all of the other things attending to the needs of the actual temple. But then what we have mentioned also are the singers. And so those would be the people who would start with the corporate worship again. That would be a part of it, going back to David's time and then continued through the kings. And now here, as they go back to start, it looks like they're again doing all of those same things. Then there are the gatekeepers. And these are the people who are taking care of the needs of the people coming and going. And this is the keeping of the grounds. This is watching over the whole area of where all of the ministry would be taking place. So these are the servants, if you will. Verse 33 mentions the Nethinim. The Nethinim were a different group of servants that served just the Levites. And so, again, just notice the structure all the way back to this time of putting back in place everything as it was supposed to be. And again, remember, this isn't going to just happen overnight. By the time that they get there really isn't much to work with. And so they're kind of having to start from scratch in this. They're given the resources in order to make it happen. They have some of the implements that'll be necessary, but they've got to pretty much start from scratch to put together a place where they can do all of these things. But they're putting in place the manpower and the people who are put there specifically for those tasks. Those people are being put in place, and they come back in the initial wave. So you can read through again those names. I realize I'm not doing all of these names because ultimately, if we were going to do them, it's doing them it's reading the names for the sake of reading the names, but we don't know much about them. These aren't people who have much of a history, and it's a history that is not. It's very important, and even to us, it's important because God makes sure that everything is orderly. This, though, is a record that's important to them, and that's why it is preserved through the writing of Ezra. And so he does this, and he's the one who makes sure. Now, remember, by the time that Ezra writes this, by the time that he comes into Jerusalem, it is well over 100 years from the time of the initial captivity, and we'll get into all of that timeline. In fact, some of the graphs that I put up earlier really kind of go into that. You can see how long it was from when the captivity happened till actually Ezra makes his way in to do what he's doing, and how far distant it is from the time of Zerubbabel. So it's a very, very long time. Now, in verse 55, it says, the sons of Solomon's servants, the son of Sotai, the sons of Sophereth, and the sons of Peruda, and then it gives the names of those. So again, think about the detail of this. These go back all the way to Solomon's time, which, we're talking about, 500 years. We're talking about a very significant amount of time from the time of Solomon to now. There are servants that come down through his line. So a little, round figures 500 years or less. But in round figures, really, really a big thing. Now look at this at verse 61, because I mentioned it a little bit earlier, and I know that we'll end up, we'll conclude a little early for this one, because we start to get into the things that we really want to, we want to focus on is chapter 3, and this is what they're able to do once they put back in place the kind of corporate worship as it should have been. But let's look at verse 61 and 61 through 63, because I believe that this is significant. And what it does show you, if we ever ask ourselves the questions, why are they so tedious in genealogies? Why are they so worried about all of this detail to the names and the places? And it just seems so over the top. Let's remember that people were not just expected, or they were not just going to do whatever they wanted to do, or if God had done something in a way that may very well have been where God didn't want them continuing on for some kind of wicked thing that they had done. Jehoiachin, I just gave that example. There would be something lost in that genealogy. Something would be cut off, but they would want to keep records. And if, as Ezra is writing these things down, notice the degree of accuracy that there is in this, even in his time. Again, well over 100 years after the initial removal of the people from Jerusalem, these records still exist. But in verse 61 it says, now, and of the sons of the priests, the sons of Habiah, the sons of Koz, the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was called by their name. These sought their listing among those who were registered by genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore, they were excluded from the priesthood as defiled. Interesting. If they said who they were, but they were not able to find records that showed that they were entitled to that. And so, as it says here at the end of this, they showed them as being defiled. Doesn't say why that is, but that's just a way of saying they no longer had the right to what the family name and the genealogy should have entitled them, but for some reason they were considered as defiled. And so the governor said to them that they should not eat of the most holy things until a priest could consult the Urim and the Thummim. And those were what was inside of the breastplate of the high priest, where they could inquire of God and get a determination. But notice how this was all handled. It was when they went to the official records did not mention them. And they showed them and they treated them as though they were defiled. And they said, you can't partake of the things that the priests would partake of for your own personal consumption, or when it comes to ministering for the people, until we are able to get God's ruling on this. Really interesting. So again, one of the reasons why the genealogies to us may seem a little tedious and a little over the top and way too detailed, now you know why. It's just one of the main reasons. There is a care that they have for the institutions that God has put in place, and whether or not a person really did have the right to do or to be who they said that they were. So, in verse 64, the whole assembly together was 42,360. Now remember, how crazy is this, that they've been reduced to this point? Remember, by the time that they came into the promised land through Joshua, they were probably in the 2 million range, somewhere thereabouts. And so in that time, they've had the captivity that happened with the Babylonians, and so much had happened because of the north and the Assyrians wiping them out. But in that first wave that comes back, these are the ones that God's heart moved upon. This is all that is of the heads of the houses, and it doesn't matter. It'll tell you that there's some other numbers that needed to be added to it. So that, let's read it one more time. The whole assembly together was 42,360, besides their male and female servants, of whom there were 7,337. And they had 200 men and women singers. And this doesn't mention whatever family members there would be, wives, children, all the rest of it. But still, it's a pretty small number compared to what there would have been in the time of, even when Judah and Benjamin had their numbers. Their fighting men were in the hundreds of thousands. And this is all that comes back in the initial wave. It's a pretty interesting thing. So it gives us the number of their horses in verse 66, camels in 67. And the heads of their fathers' houses in 68, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, they offered freely for the house of God to erect it in its place. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for the work of the 61,000 gold drachmas, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly garments. And so the priests and the Levites, some of the people, the singers and the gatekeepers, and the Nethinim dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. So not everybody was put there simply for the sake of building the temple, though that's the primary reason, but it was to begin to once again populate the land that they had been driven from. So remember, God says, I'm driving you out for 70 years, but it's not final. And it's not just for the temple's sake, but it's to populate the land once again. He wanted God in a perfect world, God would have had them brought back. However he moved upon their hearts to do it was to bring the people back. They could sustain themselves. They could work the land again, because now the land had had rest from them, and God was going to allow them to get back into the land. It should be a place where there's corporate worship once again. The temple should be rebuilt. Everything should be back in its normal, proper order, though it will take decades to get to where it's supposed to get. So we'll pick up then at chapter 3 next week, and we'll see the very beginnings of that, putting things back in the corporate worship the way that it's supposed to be. So we'll pick up at chapter 3 next week, and hope that you're able to join us. Once again, if you wanted to get your hands on those files that I had at the beginning when I had mentioned putting them up, and if you couldn't screenshot them, I can send them to you in email. Or if you have any questions about what we're covering here in the text, then you can send me an email for that as well. And we'll pick up at chapter 3 next week.